jump in between now and the next minute or next couple minutes or so, um, feel free to drop your name and location in the chat box to let us know that you're here, where you're from. It's great to have everybody. And I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Thomas for a minute.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to V3 webinar. I'm the recruitment manager for the V3 movement, and I just wanted to give you a quick hello. My wife and I planted a missional church in the Washington, D.C. metro area years ago, and then we've also founded a nonprofit ministry that walks alongside spiritual refugees and people who've experienced trauma or wounds from their religious spaces. And then I've been coaching for the V3 movement for about 10 years now. And I've experienced the excitement and blessing of being co-vocational for the past 10 years. And in just a few moments, you're going to hear from Brad and Matt. I'm confident their conversation will be insightful and exciting for you all. I'm hanging around because I'm excited to pick up some more nuggets about the CoVo life and pick up some ideas. I think it's an incredibly futuristic and relevant conversation. But I'm popping on real quick because I would love to connect with you beyond this webinar. So I would love to, if you would be up for a Zoom or a phone call, I'd love to connect with you and just hear more about where you're at on your missional journey, what dreams or visions are kind of stirring in you right now, what tensions or struggles are you facing. I'd love to hear about all of that. So if you're interested, I'm going to drop my email and my cell phone number in the chat box. So if you want to shoot me an email or a text message, I would love to connect beyond the webinar. It's one of my favorite things to do is just hear what you're up to and see how we can be praying for you, supporting you, and then maybe how the V3 movement might continue to resource you. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Matt and Brad here.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for being here. Before I introduce Brad, the way this is going to work today is that Brad is going to present and share on this topic of co-vocation, what all that means, and his experience with that, journeying with leaders across the country and the world. But also, so he'll do that for a time, and then we'll have some dialogue, some Q&A. If you have a question or a thought that you want to share, we'd love for you to be a part of that dialogue, to drop a question. Please put it in the chat box, and I will bring it up when we get to that time. So if you have a thought based off something that Brad shares while he's sharing it, we'd love for you to just drop it in the chat box, either an observation or a question, and that can contribute to the dialogue time after he presents. So please make sure to do that. Brad Brisco is an author, pastor, a missiologist, and has really been kind of at the forefront of the missional church movement in the West for 25, 30 years now. He's been a really significant voice. He's written a number of books and publications and spoken and coached and trained, and as a denominational leader, he's really, from my opinion, like one of the top kind of experts around missional thinking and practice in the West, and particularly around co-vocational vocation and efforts and church planting and how that works with missional life. And a resource that you can check out to learn more about this is called, if you go to, oh, now I just lost it. Is it CoVochurchplanting.org or is it
No,
.com?
.com. Right. CoVochurchplanting.com.
Yeah. This is kind of a one-stop shop for a bunch of resources, including videos and an ebook and blog posts and all sorts of other resources around CoVo stuff. So we'd love for you to check that out. We'll make sure to drop that. Tanya already dropped that in the chat box, so you can check that out. And so thanks for being here, Brad. We're excited to chop it up with you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Matt. So here's what I'd like to do is just really share a little bit around 2 or 3 what I would consider kind of crucial themes or important themes around CoVo. And my favorite thing to do, though, is just a dialogue, respond to some questions, some things that you're processing, maybe that you're already considering, but also maybe in light of something that I share. So again, just two or three kind of big rocks or big themes. So the first one is you'll notice if you hear me talk on the topic very often, you'll hear me use the language of both bivocational and covocational. So sometimes that can be confusing. So I think it's a good place to start. It's just to make a distinction there between that language. So I would say, gosh, it's probably been about a decade ago now. I just started giving more emphasis to BiVo church planting. And one of the things I recognized, the more conversations I had around bivocationalism, was I discovered what I would call a biased narrative around bivocational church planting, bivocational pastoring. And what I mean by biased narrative is that when you would ask most people in the church what comes to mind when they hear the word bivocational, it was almost always negative. Like it was always like, divided attention, part-time, divided time in the marketplace versus the church. It was just always negative. And I felt like that only wasn't helpful. I don't think it's biblical. In fact, I think bivocational leaders, they should be our champions. They should be our church planting heroes. So one of the things we felt like we needed to do about a decade ago was to expand the language. Now, you'll notice I say expand the language and not change the language. But I felt like we needed to kind of come up with additional language that spoke to other nuances of BiVo. So we started playing around with words, and we landed on this word co-vocational. So a little difference between those two words. So here's the way I'll describe it sometimes, is I'll say, have you ever heard the word bifurcate? To bifurcate means to take one thing and divide it into two parts. Well, unfortunately, I think that's what we do a lot of times when we hear the word bivocational, is we compartmentalize or we bifurcate our primary calling in the marketplace and our calling with like church work. I hear all the time guys say things like, well, I do my job over here so I can do mission and ministry over here. Well, again, I don't think that's helpful. So we started playing around this with different words. And now in comparison to BiVo, think of this word CoVo or co-vocational. So co, comes from the Latin prefix com, C-O-M, which means to have in common. So I like to say, think of words like co-author, co-pilot, companion, co-laborer. Instead of compartmentalizing or bifurcating, it's really about aligning those two things together. So I think it's just a helpful expansion of the language, because I'm convinced there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people in our churches that didn't know that it was an option to be a school teacher and plant a church, or be a mechanic and plant a church, or be an architect and plant a church. So I think it just opens up all kinds of opportunities. Now, so you'll notice I use both BiVo, CoVo. So here's a little nuance for me, though, using both language. Is for me, a bivocational church planter is someone that has a part-time job in the marketplace that they see as temporary. So in other words, their hope or dream is the church plant grows large enough that they can leave their part-time job and focus full-time on the church plant. And to that, I would say 2 thumbs up, right? There's nothing wrong with that. A lot of times we'll make reference to the Apostle Paul in Acts 18 as a tent maker. Nothing wrong with that. But a co-vocational church planter is someone that has a primary calling in the marketplace that they never intend to leave. So again, they know God has called or wired them to be a school teacher or an architect or an engineer or a web designer or a business owner, whatever it might be. And at the same time, they feel like God's calling them to start something. So that's the little nuance for me. One's not better than the other. Now, I do think there's some greater benefits of being co-vocational. And then that's the next thing that I want to talk about is I think to change that bias narrative around bivocationalism, like I said, I felt like we needed to expand the language. But I think maybe the greatest way to change the bias narrative is talk about the enormous benefits of being bivocational or co-vocational. So there are lots of different benefits, but I'll typically frame the benefits of being co-vocational around missiological and financial. Now, I'll mention a couple other ones, but these are like the 2 big rocks or the 2 big buckets of benefits of being co-vocational. So let me dig into them a little bit. And then if this prompts some questions, this is one of the things we can dialogue about. So with the missiological benefits, first off, I would say if you're co-vocational, you have access to a mission field you would never have otherwise. And I mean, this is a no-brainer, right? I mean, everybody gets this, that if you have a primary calling in the marketplace, you have opportunities for relational connections with people that are never, ever going to come to a church service or church activity. So you just have access to a mission field that you wouldn't have. But then a couple other, what I would call missiological benefits, is I think it gives you enormous street cred or respectability, both inside the church and outside the church. So inside the church, it gives you great respectability with people in your congregation because they know that on some level, you can relate to what they struggle with Monday through Friday in the marketplace, right? I mean, they know you can relate to what it's like to have a boss or have conflict with fellow employees or whatever it might be, that you can relate to that. So it gives you respectability with people in your church. But maybe even more important than that, I think it gives you great respectability with people outside the walls of the church. So in a time when people are, skeptical at best and hostile at worst towards the church, when you can lead, when you meet somebody and inevitably they ask you what you do, instead of leading with I'm a church planter or a pastor, if you can lead with your primary calling in the marketplace, we all know it just creates a longer runway for that relationship to be cultivated. So I think it gives you respectability inside and outside. So there's just lots of different like missionary or missiological benefits of being co-vocational. But then the second one I would say is financial. Now the financial benefits I usually frame around 3 words or phrases. I'd say first off, I think it provides greater financial stability for the church planter and the church planter's family. So what I mean by that is that when the primary support for the planter is coming from the marketplace, especially when that marketplace calling provides benefits like insurance, vacation, maybe some kind of a retirement, there's just less financial strain on the church planter's family because that church planter doesn't have to have multiple side hustles to try to make ends meet. So the first one is I think there's greater financial stability for the church planter. Secondly, I think there's greater financial stability for the church plant. So once again, this is kind of a no-brainer, but when that new church plant doesn't have to worry about providing salary support or benefits to the church planter, there's just going to be more resources available for mission and ministry for that church plant. And then third, I would say there's greater financial stability for the church planting entity. So regardless of what church planting network or denomination you might be planting with, there simply isn't enough money to plant all the churches that need to be planted with fully funded planters. And another little nuance of that I think is important is that there's cities all over North America and around the world that are just too expensive to send a fully funded church planter in downtown Vancouver or New York or Seattle. The only way we're going to be able to plant a church in some of those urban centers is with co-vocational leaders that are indigenous and they already have full-time jobs in that setting or context. And then on the flip side of that, we all know there are underserved, underprivileged population groups all around the world that if we're going to define sustainability by the church planter having a fully, a full support salary, it's just never going to happen because they're in an impoverished area to where there's just not enough money that comes into the church plant to provide a salary for the planter. So once again, I would just say the only way we're going to ever see any type of church planting movement is engaging bivocational and co-vocational church planters. So there's just enormous missiological benefits. There's enormous financial benefits. And then just a couple other things I would just mention. These are little things, but they're still benefits. I think if you're co-vocational, I think a planter can kind of use their prophetic voice without fear of anyone in the congregation saying like, I'm pulling my funding because I didn't like what you had to say. An issue outside the church or maybe an issue inside the church. I think also there's all kinds of benefits about like empowerment, both with the team, but also the whole body of Christ. I've just seen this. I've had the privilege over the last several years to interview maybe 60 or 70 co-vocational leaders. And I have 8 questions I always like to ask. The first question is always, what's the greatest benefit? And it's always something about access to a mission field. But a second benefit they talk about is that when they have a full-time job in the marketplace, it empowers the people in their congregation because they know when that planter is working 50, 60, maybe 70 hours a week in the marketplace, they can't do everything. And of course, they shouldn't do everything, right? So it activates all the people of God. It's the priesthood of all believers. I just think CoVo not only provides shared leadership around the church planting team, but it helps to activate the whole body of Christ. So there's other benefits like that. And a last little benefit I would just say is, and this varies a little bit on what your marketplace calling is, but in many cases, I think that calling in the marketplace can provide professional development for the church planter. Things around, time management or teamwork or collaboration or customer service, and some of those things they can bring into the life of the church. So again, those are two big pieces. Like, what's the nuance between BiVo, CoVo? What are the benefits? And then the last thing I want to share, and then let's just dialogue about all this, is it's easy to talk about the benefits, but I think if we're going to be fair, we have to talk about the challenge. And again, these interviews that I've done with 60 or 70 CoVo planners over the last few years, the second question I always ask them is, what's the greatest challenge? And bar none, every single time, the answer always has to do something with time management. So, different planters use a different language, but it's all about, how do you balance rhythms of family and ministry and health and work? And so there's a lot of things we could talk about here, but let me share, there's kind of the typical time management stuff, about calendar and priorities and distractions and all of that is good and helpful. But specifically when it comes to co-vocational church planting, there's three things I always like to mention and talk about. The first one is team. So anybody that's been involved in church planting knows it's best to plant a church with a team. But if you're co-vocational, there is no other option. Like, you have to plant with a team. In fact, if I had a conversation with a potential CoVo planter, and if they don't have a team, if they're not working on a team, I just tell them, you just got to push the pause button, because there's no possible way you can plant a church with a full-time job in the marketplace. And now my personal bias, and I know V3 is a big proponent of this as well, is I think the best way to think about teams, church planting teams, is through the lens of APEST. So, I say all the time, when you talk to a church planter and you mention church planting teams, I think the majority of church planters, they default to ministry categories. So in other words, they say, okay, well, I need a team. I need a worship leader. I need a youth person, a children's person. They think ministry categories. But I think the best way to think about a team is think about APEST, which most of the people on the call are probably familiar with it. It's the acronym in Ephesians chapter 4 of apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. I just think that's the single best way to think about encouraging people to operate out of their giftings as part of a church planting team. So how do you overcome the challenge of time? First off, you have to do it with a team. Secondly, I would say, I think we need to recapture what I would call a robust theology of work. So what I mean by this is, I think we need to help our planters that have full-time jobs in the marketplace to recognize whatever work they're doing is good. God's created us for work. Work is good. I don't want them to bifurcate, because I've heard planters say, like, man, I almost feel guilty the amount of time I spend in the marketplace because that's time I can't spend on the church. And I want to say, no, look, you got to blow that up. Like, you got to recognize that whatever God's called you to do in the marketplace, you're bringing common good and blessing to people. And then I want to help them see how might they begin to align those two things more closely together. So I think there's a theology of work piece. And then the last piece, I would say, is we have to rethink church planting. So if you have a full-time job in the marketplace, you cannot plant churches the way we've always planted churches. Raise a bunch of money, launch a Sunday-centric, launch large approach with lots of programs. You just can't do it. You have to enter into the context thinking and acting like a missionary. And the good thing about being co-vocational is you have a much longer runway to start with missionary behaviors and activities and not with the Sunday morning worship service. So there's a little phrase I say all the time. I tweet it once a week, and I just say, we have to help church planters think less like a pastor starting a Sunday morning worship service and more like a missionary engaging in a unique context. And once again, you can do that if you're co-vocational, because you don't have the financial stresses or pressures to say, man, I got to get a bunch of tithing Christians a part of this deal so we can be financially sustainable, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. You can have a much longer runway and have a much kind of slow growth kind of thing. Not start with a Sunday morning worship service. Again, you'll get to a gathering, but just not start with a gathering. So that was a lot of rambling there, but I think for me, those are the two or three kind of big rocks to kind of introduce the concept of co-vocational. And then, yeah, Matt, I'd love to just see if the people are, what are they processing here? Questions, follow up, feedback they might provide.
Yeah. Wonderful, Brad. Thank you. Yeah. Just a reminder, if you have a thought, question you want to uh, ask and engage Brad with along this topic, please drop it in the chat and we'll bring it up. I'll get us going. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Any of us who are in kind of missional church planting world, church world in general, even if it's not kind of in the missional vein, and say, things are different post-COVID in a pretty significant way. How would you say your work and even your interaction, coaching, relationships, what has changed in the bivocational, co-vocational aspect of things in our kind of post-COVID landscape now in the West? Are things kind of, if I was going to be a bivocational church planter 10 or 15 years ago, are things more or less the same as they would have been 10 or 15 years ago for me than they are now? Or do you feel like things have really shifted?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I thought they were going to shift more than they have. They certainly have shifted without a doubt. But I think the gravitational pull to just go back to the way things were is so strong that coming out of COVID,
Mhm.
probably half the people just did everything they possibly could to go back the way it was before. But some of them couldn't. So without a doubt, I think COVID accelerated some of those shifts. But I would admit the shift is probably only about half of what I thought it was going to be. But it's still more accelerated than it was before. Now a couple other things there I would say too is that I've seen without a doubt there are more, there's this shift from church planters now that recognize that they need to start with a BiVo CoVo mindset because we'd had way too many church planters that started with some really good partners and they started with some funding from a denomination or church planting network and they thought the church was going to go large enough that they could leave their part-time job and focus full-time on the church, and it didn't happen. I mean, the reality is right now in a North American context, that rarely happens anymore. So what's the downside of that is I've seen too many guys that feel like a failure because 2 years in or 3 years in, they have to go and get a part-time job, and they didn't think they would have to. So they've become BiVo CoVo out of necessity. And I just think how much better served they would be if we would have this conversation on the front end and they started this way and they just stayed there. I know guys all the time that I mean, there are opportunities where the church grows large enough that they could leave their part-time job. Again, this is the exception, not the rule. But guys that have really been BiVo CoVo, even when they could leave, they don't. They stay because they begin to recognize the missiological and financial benefits of being in the marketplace. So what I've seen guys do is that instead of going full-time at the church, they hire another part-time BiVo CoVo. I mean, I know churches that have
Sure.
all their staff is BiVo CoVo. So yeah, so back to your question, man, I think, yeah, it has shifted. I think some of it is, the we were kind of sucked back in. Some people were, but some just out of necessity. And then the other thing that I've seen post-COVID, because some of the finances didn't come back, some of the people didn't come back, that there are guys that were full-time that are now needing to discover some type of bivocational, side hustle. And it's really difficult for some guys that don't have any kind of skill or trade. They went to Bible college, they went to seminary, and the only thing they've done is work inside the walls of the church.
Right.
And that's not my primary focus. I mean, my primary focus is with church planters, but I still have conversations with guys all the time that are just trying to figure out how do they make, finances work when their congregation is actually shrinking in size.
Right. That's a different kind of thing of like kind of planting a church with a particular way of life for the planter in terms of their vocation versus, the church is a different size than it was before COVID,
Right.
for example. And now we've got to figure out how this works in a different way. That's a different kind of.
One other little thing I would say that kind of speaks to your question too, and it's just a little statement that I try to remind people of all the time, is I like to say co-vocational is a strategy, not a model. And what I mean by that is too often I think when we hear BiVo or CoVo, most people think small. They think, oh, if you're bivocational, house church, small church, micro church. And it might be, I would say probably 70 to 80% of the planters that I know that are co-vocational, yeah, they're not leading any kind of, large church or mega church, but it's not a model. It's not about the size. It's a strategy, because I do know churches that are fairly large, 200, 300 people, come show up on Sunday morning, and they're 100% co-vocational. And it's because they've created a team around BiVo CoVo. So I would just say, just think strategy. It's a missiological and financial strategy for church planting. It's not really about a model.
Yeah, that's great. Question came in about thoughts around theological education for pastors, church planters who are pursuing a bivocational, co-vocational route strategy.
Yeah.
How you've seen that? Yeah, just maybe any of your thoughts on that in general, where you've seen that done well. Yeah, anything around.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think with co-vocational planters, we need to reconsider content and delivery. So I just think the content of what we really need to, it's missionary training is really, we need to do more missionary training rather, and it doesn't mean there's not theological training that's involved, but I like to think about theological training through the lens of mission. So I just think the content has to be different, and without a doubt, we have to deliver that content differently. Now, thank goodness, most Bible college and seminaries now across North America have, fully 100% online training, which is fabulous. I would say, and I know this is a little idealistic, I think the best case scenario in the future is theological education is going to be rooted in the local church. And I know I'll make my seminary, and I have no, qualms. I have 2 seminary degrees, so I'm not down on seminary education. But I just think the best case scenario are, residencies. It's theological training that's taking place in the local church. And so really, I just try to do as much of that as possible. I do all kinds of, CoVo cohort kind of things and webinars and stuff like this. Most of the time I do those. In fact, I did one last night, and I did it at 8 o'clock Eastern. And it's because when guys have full-time jobs and women as well, they can't jump on a call typically, at noon or whatever. So that's what I mean by delivery is we've got to provide training in the evenings, on the weekends, that sort of thing. And virtual, of course, is an absolute necessity.
Yep. Another question is maybe what have been some ways that you've found to help people who are coming, or to help a congregation or groups of people who are coming from more of a traditional kind of church mindset or model. They're kind of used to having a full-time pastor, or maybe a church team, a ministry staff of multiple full-time staff members or something like that. Ways to kind of help them wrap their minds and hearts potentially around embracing a different kind of way of probably practicing church in general, but also kind of seeing the pastoral leaders have a different kind of vocational strategy. I think the question is kind of around not so much how do you help kind of leaders embrace this, but how do you help maybe a congregation start to embrace this yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I think, in a church that's moving towards more of a BiVo CoVo leadership or planting from the get-go, if you have anybody that's been church for a very long time, you have to have conversations around expectations, without a doubt. I mean, expectations that as leaders we put on ourselves are also congregational expectations. And I do think one of the best ways to get at that, to go back to APAST, I just think typically we haven't done a very good job of helping people in the congregation recognize their giftings. And, we don't have to go down this rabbit hole. And again, a lot of people on the call already understand and get this. But, when I was first taught Ephesians chapter 4, I was taught that the APAS text was a leadership text, or I would even say a clergy text, that those were gifts given to the clergy or leadership to equip the saints for the work of ministry. And of course, I don't see it like that anymore. It's a body text, not a leadership text. So those are gifts given to the body. They're not roles, they're not offices, but they're gifts. They're callings, they're vocations given to the whole body. So they're gifts given to the saints to equip the saints for the work of ministry. So I just remember, when I planted church 30 years ago, man, I just really struggled with how, if you're not a shepherd teacher, like if you're not a pastor or if you're not a teacher, where's your place in ministry in the life of the church? And APES helped to open that up for me to see that there's multiple different kinds of gifting. So I think that's part of it, is we need to help everybody in the congregation recognize their calling, their gifting for the body of Christ, and then do everything we possibly can to help activate that. Again, it goes back to the priesthood of all believers. It's the body of Christ, right? And everybody not only gets to play, everybody has to play. Like, no one sits on the bench. And that's just a moniker I think we just have to repeat over and over and over again, because this, professionalism of, we have the professional stage person and then everybody else is passive. It's just not biblical, right? I mean, we all get that. So, but the status quo, the power of the status quo is very, very strong. So that's not going to change overnight. But I think those are the conversations through the lens of APAS, constantly talking about activating all the people of God to engage in mission and ministry. And again, I think CoVo helps to push that conversation, because people recognize, if you've got a full-time job, we just can't lean on you to do everything, and which is, the way it should be anyway. But when somebody is fully funded by the congregation, sometimes it can just be hard to overcome that.
Yeah. Yeah. I know probably a common question is like, something to the effect of, what types of vocations align the best, or, the best with missional church planting, and what types of vocations are probably harder to pull off with, to
Sure.
kind of lean into both. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know that's maybe a too black and white of a question, or any wisdom kind of around how to think about how there can be some congruency between both, that are things
Yeah.
you've seen. That
Yeah, no, those are great
questions
questions.
there.
So first thing I would say, it's kind of funny, is just a couple of days ago, I took the last 3 monthly webinars that I do, and one of the questions I ask everybody that participates in the webinar is what their vocation is in the marketplace. And there were over 30 different, now some of them were repeats, but there were over 30 different marketplace callings. I mean, you name it, and I could say, yes, I know somebody that's doing that. I mean, from pilot, all kinds of business owners. I mean, just everything, restaurant manager, healthcare worker, nonprofit, school, lots of school teachers, all of that. So it just runs the gamut. But back to your question, I do think a lot of times I'll kind of frame it around 2 or 3 different things. We'll talk about time, money, and relational capital. So kind of a silly illustration I'll give sometimes is I'll say, hey, if you work a job in a cubicle all by yourself from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, probably not the greatest job to have to plant a church, right? As a co-vocational leader. Like, if you're by yourself, 8 hours, 9 hours a day. But if you can work in that cubicle Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and make enough money that you can be off Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, then maybe it works. Or let's say, you're working in service industry. Let's say, just as, silly example, let's say you're a barista. You're not making very much money, but you might meet 300 people a day. So there's like this balance between how much money can you make with this vocation, how much time does it take, and then what's the relational capital, relational connections you have. Now, rarely, if ever, are you going to have a vocation that, it's a 10 on all three of those spheres. But if it's a 10 on one of those, then, maybe it works. But some of them that I know that, man, have just done a really good job, somebody that has somewhat of a flexible schedule, school teachers when they're off during the summer, or real estate agents that, business owners, if it is a kind of business where you can kind of dictate your own, weekly schedule, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think that's a helpful, just super practical to think about time, money, and relational connections.
Another question I have, this hasn't come up in the chat, but how have you seen this flesh out kind of along different ethnic groups in the West in particular, which, again, we can talk about how there's, very different, also like varying kind of ecclesiological understandings, right? So in different communities, the understanding of the role of the church and kind of how the church organizes its life together is going to differ to varying degrees. But um, for example, have you found that it's oftentimes more difficult for people of color to pull off this type of vocation, or is it actually not as difficult as maybe some people might think it might be, or is it the other way around? I don't know. What's your observation with those types of different types of communities?
Yeah, so two thoughts there. And I don't lose one of them as I'm talking. So the first thing I'd say, and I'm glad you brought this up, Matt, is that I never want to come off, we're talking about CoVo, like, we've created a new term and a new thing. Well, it's not new everywhere else, right? I mean, like, we need to learn from every other ethnic group because this was the norm forever to be bi-vocational, co-vocational. I've heard people say tri-vocational, multi-vocational. Now, for the most part, I mean, again, I know this is a generalization and too simplistic, but I think this whole CoVo conversation, for the most part, is to try to recalibrate back before 5 decades of church growth mentality that was all about professionalization, Sunday centric, launch large, blah, 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 seeker sensitive, attractional, whatever you want to call it. So there is a recalibration kind of back to this CoVo mindset that for the most part is necessary in white American evangelical church mindset. Right. Okay. So there's so much we need to learn from every other population, every other ethnic group. So that's the first thing. The second one, though, I would say is that even though that's the case, and you just alluded to this, there are still very strong ecclesiastical frameworks that still need a deep paradigm shift. Because, and this is true, I think, in African American community, I think it's true in Hispanic community. Part of the Hispanic community is the influence from Roman Catholic Church that, you've got the priests, although we don't call them priests, but there's still this, enormous chasm between the laity and the clergy. And I think that's a little bit true. There's kind of this, and again, it's a generalization, I realize, and I'm certainly no expert here, but I think in some African American congregations that I'm familiar with, there is also like a chasm there for different reasons. But so there is still there's still a paradigm shift there that needs to happen. But it's not, it's more about, it's probably more about, the priesthood of all believers and deprofessionalizing ministry, some of that, not so much BiVo CoVo, because in most all of those cases, they are BiVo CoVo. So that's not where the shift needs to take place. I think it needs to take place more on just the way we see the form and function of the church, I guess, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. Right. It has less to do with, yeah. Yeah. It's good. Questions come in is, can you speak to the different ways that a co-vocational planter might flavor their faith community through their primary vocation or calling? I think kind of what the idea of flavor is kind of, the how might the vocation of the planter kind of give a certain vibe or ethos or culture maybe to the church plant as a whole, or I don't know if they're thinking about that in a negative or a positive way from the question exactly, but
yeah, I'll just be honest, I've never thought about that. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there are some influences depending on what the vocation is. Certainly might be like meeting rhythms and some of that, but yeah, man, I'd almost need to process that and just think about different scenarios that I'm aware of, and are they different? I just can't think of an example where I'm sure there are. If I think about different vocations and how that has shaped or influenced the faith community.
I wonder I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind, although this may not be exactly what they're kind of trying to get at, but is, if I'm a church planter, but I'm in finance as my vocation, then I'm likely connecting to a lot of other people who are kind of in that world. And maybe it's very possible that, the connections I'm making kind of in the finance world are going to connect to whatever the church expression is that we're creating, which will likely to influence the flavor or whatever of the community over time. I don't know. Maybe that's some of what they were wondering, but
Yeah, and maybe, and again, I'd have to process this, but I'm sure this is the case that I know there are planters that have reached a greater percentage of people in their marketplace calling and, like finance, let's say. And I can't think, I mean, I don't know a specific example with this in finance, but if they reached a bunch of other people that they worked with, yeah, you would think that would influence a little bit or shape,
sorry.
you know, school teachers. I mean, I definitely know examples where they've reached more school teachers in their marketplace calling. So, yeah, I guess along that line, it probably does help. I mean, it probably does shape things a little bit. But again, I just can't think of a really good example of that. But even though I'm sure that happens on some degree for sure.
Yeah, that's great. An observation that we've made in V3 over the years, when we've, um, you know, something close to 1,000 people have gone through V3's cohorts over the past 13, 14 years now, something like that, around the world. And when we've done surveys and things over the years, that absolutely the key indicator that comes back to us as like whether or not a church plant has survived, number
Mhm.
one, but gotten over the initial early hump, but also is continuing to reach people in the neighborhood, make disciples, live on mission, not perfectly or anything, but bear fruit over time. That 100%, the biggest factor that answers whether or not those things are going to happen or not is the ability of creating some kind of a team that is sharing the weight, the leadership, the care, the vision of the community. To do that, and you have to have that. That has to be developed. It doesn't necessarily always have to be there on day one, but you have to be moving towards that really intentionally in a focused way, or else
Yeah.
it's just not going to work, right? And it seems to me that this approach of CoVo, and you really got at this when you were talking and sharing earlier, like kind of really forces the issue at the
Right.
beginning. It forces you to really get serious about empowering people, um, rallying people together to not just, listen to one person kind of cast the vision, but to cultivate the vision together, to find ways to live on mission together, to have more mutuality together. Um, uh, just an observation from kind of our experience in V3, uh, that goes along with what you're saying too.
Well, and it's just the nature of the church, isn't it? I mean,
Right.
again, we use the language of body all the time. But we push it off to the side and we want to have the lead pastor, and it's just not the way it was meant to be. And if we really want, I mean, we just got to activate everybody to play their part. And yeah, anytime I do training on cultivating healthy church planting teams, yeah, two things we talk about all the time are team dynamics and team productivity. So team dynamics is all about APEST. And I encourage planters, look, I kind of have this little checklist I want them to go down through. First off, they have to identify how they're gifted. Secondly, they have to identify what gifts are missing on the team. Because Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, if all five of those gifts aren't being exercised, the church will not reach maturity. He actually says the church will not experience the fullness of Christ. But I think it's pretty easy to argue the church isn't mature. And I think in part is because we've been operating on two of those gifts of shepherd teacher. And we've relegated the, apostle, prophet, evangelist either to the margins or they've completely left the church. So so I tell planters, CoVo planters, first identify, figure out how are you wired? What's your primary gifting? Secondly, what gifts are missing on your team? And then third, how are you going to ensure that all of those gifts have a voice on your team? And then the fourth thing is just recognize that it's actually an equipping passage. I mean, it's to equip the saints for the work of ministry. So I like to say, look, if you're a gifted teacher, you should be equipping others to be better teachers. If you're a gifted evangelist, you ought to be equipping others to be better evangelists. And it's the same with all 5 of those gifts. So team dynamics is just a huge piece. And then team productivity, for that, for CoVo planters that I work with, we use Working Genius. And again, I'm sure some people on the call are familiar with it, but that's about how you're gifted to get a task done. So, the point is, the gift within the church and getting stuff done, you just can't do it by yourself, because we all have certain gifts, which means we don't have all those other gifts. So we've got to bring people onto the team with those other gifts, both in team dynamics, but also team productivity. Like, how are we really going to get stuff done? We need to have people that are gifted in, different aspects of that productivity work. So, the team, again, it sounds harsh, but if you're CoVo and if you don't have a team, just wait. Push the pause button and be working. Like you said, man, at least be working towards that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. Okay. Here's another question. What are some real life examples you've seen of how CoVo leaders have started new churches that gather in ways that break out of the typical event or kind of attractional program-based model? So maybe 1 or 2 examples that come to your minds of, leaders that and have worked with.
Yeah. So I would say in most cases, it probably relates to networking together smaller expressions of church. So, before we started recording, Matt, you and I talked about it. We live in the Tampa Bay area. We moved here 6 years ago. And one of the primary ministry reasons we moved here is I wanted to be closer to this group here called the Tampa Underground. And the Tampa Underground, I think, is the single best example of what I would call a decentralized network of microchurches. So they've been at it for 17 or 18 years. I mean, there's a real proof of concept there. Right now, I think there's probably 120, 130 microchurches all over the Tampa Bay area. That number kind of goes up and down. But all of those microchurches, every single one of them is led by a BiVo CoVo leader. And then they're networked together in this thing called the Tampa Underground. Now, anytime I talk about microchurch networks, even though I'm familiar with probably 35 or 40 networks all across the United States and Canada. But the 2 that I talk about all the time is the Tampa Underground, because they've been at it for so long, and then the KC Underground, which has just been at it for 6 years. But no, I don't know of any network in North America that has accomplished more than they've accomplished in 6 years. It's absolutely incredible. And again, it's a decentralized network of microchurches, so smaller expressions. And so that's one thing, is as bivocational or co-vocational leaders, I just think we have to think about smaller expressions that don't start with a Sunday gathering. And then the other examples I've seen, and a good bit of these, are planters that actually start nonprofits and they birth the church out of the nonprofit. So their nonprofit is their co-vocational, marketplace calling. And then there's others that are business owners. So you have nonprofit, operators or directors, but then also this is a smaller kind of like stream or sliver of the co-vocational conversation, but it's increasing all the time. I know guys all over the country that have started businesses, for-profit businesses, and they're birthing a church out of that. If it's co-working space, coffee shop, cafe, pubs, coffee roastery, whatever it might be. So those are just some different kind of ways to think about, church planting from a co-vocational perspective.
Yeah, great. We've got another few minutes left. If anybody has another question you'd like to throw in the mix here, now's your chance to drop it in. Another question that came up for me is, what would you say if you had to, and you very likely have already, thought about this and maybe even put something together around this, but what are some best practices for someone who is planting a church, has a primary vocation that maybe they're already quite adept at, but they're, it's not a new thing. I would imagine that would be probably something difficult that's just come to my mind now, of starting a new vocation while also, or very closely also, trying to start a faith community. Seems Like that's probably something you would advise against, I would imagine, because that's just a
Well,
lot to pull off at
yeah,
the
it
same
just
time.
varies. Yeah, and I mean, I've had those conversations before. Like somebody that's starting a
Yeah.
business and they want to plant a church. I would say I would focus on the business initially, and I've seen guys do that. And I mean, they give 6 months, a year, maybe to the business, and the whole time though they're building relational connections.
Right.
They still have some type of faith, where you're cultivating community on some level, but still very simple, doesn't take much time. So yeah, that's what I encourage more. Like if someone's actually starting a new vocation or they're starting a business, but they want to plant a church, um, yeah, unless it's a really unique scenario, I probably wouldn't try to do both simultaneously.
Yeah.
I'd probably focus on the more of the marketplace calling initially. But again, whatever that is, you're going to be building relationships and making relational connections. So, uh,
Right.
yeah. So, I just think there's simple ways, and this is something else that we do in our training that we just call cultivating community. But it's creating just a space to invite people into that isn't a church thing, but maybe it's once a week, maybe it's once a month, but it's some kind of natural thing that you do on an ongoing basis. Maybe it's a fire pit, it's a potluck, it's a game night, whatever it might be. But it's something that's
Yeah.
just super natural and easy as you're making relational connections. You can say, hey, the first Saturday night of every month, we do a fire pit and we just have our neighbors over, blah, 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 that you can welcome people into. And it's something that you're already doing. So you're not trying to add
Right.
something. So I just think, very early on kind of church planting activities, there's just really simple things like that we can do. And I think part of it too, Matt, I tell you, this whole conversation around CoVo, conversation I have with guys sometimes, or question that I'll ask is I'll just say, what kind of life do you want to have? Like,
Mm.
I'll tell you a
Yeah.
really good example of this. Just about a month ago, I was having a conversation with a guy that was in a very, very large mega church in Texas. He was leaving that church to go plant a church. This large mega church was going to be his sending church. But once he left and kind of got out of that mega church world to plant a church in another city in Texas, he wanted to have conversations about doing a micro church, kind of a network of micro churches. And he's married, has 4 kids, and he's the one that actually said this. He said, Brad, I just started thinking about like what kind of life do I want to have as we're planting this church? He says, what I do know is I don't want to have the life that I had on staff at the mega church. It's like
Mm.
I want it to
Yeah.
be more relationally connected. I want it to be more organic, And he talked about every Thursday night they had like 35 or 40 college students in their home because they were at a university campus. And he just talked about how he and his family and his kids, they just loved it. So it's like, yeah, we're gonna do this. We're not gonna do that.
Right.
So I do think a co-vocational mindset, even though it sounds daunting for a lot of people, it's like, well, wait a minute, how can you have a full-time job and plant a church? Well, you can't if we plant churches the way we've always planted churches. But if you can just think about what kind of life do I want to have? What kind of rhythms do we want to have? We just start thinking differently, I think, about mission and ministry and church planting and discipleship and all of that. It just there ought to be like these natural rhythms that just come together rather
Yeah.
than, this again, kind of 5 decades of church growth mentality that I think has just kind of hijacked the way we think of church. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
messed us all up on some level.
Right. Totally. Well, yeah, even the question, what kind of life do I want to have is more of a missionary type of question in the sense of how do I want to flourish amongst this people,
There you
this
go.
place,
Yes.
right? And
Right.
those things are going to go together in a really weird way.
Yeah.
Another question I got is, so I know we talked about like the dynamic of team being a really key piece to the health and vibrancy of the community over time with this strategy. Maybe also a dynamic, but in general, a best practice is to not be starting both communities and your vocation at the same time. There's some discernment with that, but generally that's kind of the nugget of wisdom. Are there any other kind of best practices that you've seen that are important as people are kind of maybe doing this for the first time, or maybe they already have a strong sense of marketplace vocation, and they're beginning to think about, oh, maybe I have a sense of calling to gather people in my neighborhood for some kind of missional expression, or I'm feeling this sense of calling to a particular, people group within the city. What are the important things for people to be thinking about that are best practices, nuggets of wisdom that you've?
Well, so a lot of it, I would just echo what we've already said, other than just don't move to the Sunday gathering too quickly. Uh,
Mm.
and in some cases, maybe not. And I think the first time I really saw somebody utilize this well, the four spaces, it was Dan
Yeah.
at JR in Church's Movement. Um, and I remember I was just going over that with somebody just recently, and the biggest circle is public. And, a lot of times in the church world, we make that the Sunday gathering. And
Right.
I want to say, look, for some people, they're only going to move to the third circle. Like that
Yes.
smaller community, that's going to be their church. It's not going to be the gathering of 100 to 500 or 1,000 people. That it's like they don't desire that or need that. So I just think that's a really helpful framework as well, especially if you're co-vocational. Is don't, yeah, just don't let that drive your strategy. Again, I think, I've already said this a couple of times. Just start with missionary behaviors and activities. Let community start to form, and just don't feel like you have to move too quickly to like structure the congregation. Like it's just, and I'm just convinced most people just actually aren't even looking for that. It's certainly not lost people. Now, if you're dealing with people that have a church background, it might be like, hey, well, when are we going to have the worship time and the preaching? But
Sure.
people that are on a journey of faith, again, and I hear people all the time, it's like, yeah, but we still live in enough of a Christian context, blah, blah, blah. I don't really buy it. I just think most people, they're looking to belong, they're looking for relationships, but I just don't find that many people that don't have a church background, they're looking for a Sunday morning worship service. No.
Right.
So I think, man, we can tap into that, and we can create those environments, create those spaces. And again, I think those first three circles speak to that really, really well. I just think the larger public, I just don't. I just think in a lot of church planting contexts, I don't know that. Certainly, we don't want to start there, and there's still some guys that's where they go, but I don't even know we want to get there. Like,
Right.
we might be able to stop before that last circle. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Love it. Well, we're at our time, Brad. Thank you so much for leading us in this conversation, sharing your wisdom and your experience. It's been wonderful to have you.
Well, I appreciate it, man. Yeah, I have always enjoyed the conversation around this.
Yeah, wonderful. This was again sponsored by the V3 movement and our cohort 9-month learning community cohorts. In particular, you can go to V3's website to learn more about that. You're also going to get a recording of this webinar in your inbox soon. Take care, everybody.